EPA conducted what was quote-unquote a science review in the Yakima Basin starting in 2010, concluding with a report in September of this fall. At the same time they issued that report, they also engaged in, they chose 4 families, 5 dairy farms to engage in a negotiation with those families about basically a contract or a consent agreement on what those families were going to do in response to EPA's quote-unquote findings in their report. We have a lot of problems with the quality of science they used. A number of experts from around the country, a number of state and federal agencies commented on that science, and to say the least, the quality of the science EPA used was questionable. Irregardless of that, in the last month or so, we believe that the families in EPA have kind of settled down, and we hope in the next week or so that these families in EPA are going to come to some agreement on what the next steps are. And it's my understanding, just based on a few conversations with the families, that there's going to be a process to do some scientific review of our farming practices. Specific farming practices, I would suspect things like how are we doing on manure application, water management, corrals, lagoons, really to do a good quality science review rather than this very one-time, I'll use the term questionable because it is highly questionable, the science that EPA used, really to refine that data and that information, which we've been good with all along. We're farmers, we follow NRCS guidelines, land grant guidelines, state dairy inspection guidelines and advice. And we think, frankly, we're doing a pretty good job. But if we're not, we'd like to know. We want good information that we can base those decisions on. And I think that's kind of the theme that I'm hearing in the last couple of weeks, which is good.
Why is it unique for these select farms as opposed to other dairies across the country? I mean, they're not unique to this, are they? I mean, every dairy has to deal with this now sometimes.
Well, I think the uniqueness is a couple of things, and I'm speculating a little bit here, but we've been suspecting that for the last 6 or 8 months, EPA wanted to find some farms to make an example out of. And there is a nitrate problem in Yakima. The data on that's clear, and in fact my association and the dairy community in Yakima County really over the last 3, 4, 5 years now have been embarked on a process of engaging not only dairies but the entire community in Yakima to reduce nitrate inputs, get that water back to federal standards. And I think partly there was some controversy early. EPA looked at this region and said, oh, there's controversy, there's clear nitrates, and it's in the Ninth Circuit, which doesn't hurt our case if we go to the Ninth Circuit, because the Ninth Circuit does tend to listen to agencies more than most other circuit courts in the nation. And so in part this was about finding some families to use. Can I back that up in a court of law? No. Does it walk like a duck? Yeah. And so I think, though recently I will tell you, I think EPA has backed off on that. The discussions that we're hearing are more of what we're used to and comfortable with, which is let's look at what we're doing. If it's not working right, we'll adjust and adapt, just as farmers have done since literally the Dust Bowl era.
Well, it's not necessarily proven that it's the dairies that caused this nitrate problem to begin with, is it?
No, but what we've consistently said in a number of areas, and I think some of the other areas around the West where we have dairy farmers, I'm not alone in saying this, is what we said 4 years ago when we saw the data in Yakima and some other areas in the state was it took a village to mess up the aquifer. We are part of that village. We use nitrates, as do hop growers and potato growers and spearmint and peppermint and potato growers. We're part of that village. And what we said 4 years ago is we will be part of the solution, but we can't do it alone. We need the rest of the farming community, the septic tank community, the fertilizer users, even some cities and counties that have municipal wastewater discharge to be part of that discussion also. And we're more than willing to be at the table, just so long as we're not on it.
Sure. So we're hoping maybe in a week there could be some resolution.
On the EPA thing, yes. Unfortunately, though, what has happened in the last week or so is a couple of environmental groups have now dogpiled, might be the term, They have filed lawsuits against these 4 families, 5 farms, claiming that these families violated federal EPCRA, CERCLA, and RCRA statutes, and that they want certain conditions and certain restraining orders or covenants put on these farms, as well as lawyers' fees, penalties, blah, blah, blah. EPCRA and CERCLA, we think those aspects of the lawsuit will probably go away. They've been mooted already. RCRA, Congress clearly exempted manure under federal RCRA laws, and so we'll have to look and see why the environmental groups think there's cause to claim that RCRA does apply to these families. But that's the one for dairymen across the United States, and not just dairymen, but cattlemen, poultry, anybody that uses manure. The general summary of a 48-page legal filing is that what they're claiming is that manure breaks down into things like nitrates, and while manure is exempt, the nitrate that comes from manure is not, and so therefore the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act applies, and it applies to anybody using manure that doesn't do it by the way the environmental groups want to.
In your experience in Washington State, is this one of the biggest challenges that you've had to face against the federal government or against these groups that are stockpiling?
There's 2 questions in there. When it comes to environmental groups, no. We've had these before. A number of these environmental attorneys have filed suits for over 15, 20 years now. Anytime they can find a cause du jour to file a lawsuit, usually they settle out of court for an undisclosed sum with nobody admitting guilt. Blah, blah, blah. This was the most disappointing. I think our relationship with EPA in many areas has become very good the last 10 years or so. And I think you talk to folks in California or Idaho, Oregon, a lot of places around the West. We have a job to do as dairymen. Our job is to make sure our manure is used appropriately. EPA has a job to do as well, which is to make sure everybody's equal playing field. That somebody isn't getting manure in the water. And I would say our relationship with EPA has been very professional, very much within the expectations that they have a job to do, which is enforcement. We have a job to do, which is to manage our manure appropriately. This one didn't follow that same kind of professional expectations that I've had and seen with EPA. The quality of science was atrocious. Unconscionably bad was words used by many scientists. U.S. Department of Agriculture wrote some comments that said, this science is so bad that it should be retracted. You cannot support the conclusions from the data that you have. We had the State Department of Ag, land-grant universities, scientists from Washington, Idaho, New Mexico, all look at this and say, you don't have the science you claim you have. And so that part has been disappointing. And, we've asked numerous times, guys, start over. Bring in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, bring in the State Department of Agriculture, bring in the land-grant experts, because it's clear. An example, in their report, you'll see findings that they found tetracycline in the groundwater underneath these dairies. And they said, we found tetracycline, but we found it both below the dairies and above the dairies. We don't know where it's coming from, but it must be from the dairies. These dairies are surrounded by about 70,000 acres of apples, pears, and cherries. Both conventional and organic apple, pears, and cherries have a label for tetracycline powder to be sprayed to use for fire blight control. And that label has been approved for 20, 30 years. Up to 7 pounds of wettable tetracycline powder, 33% tetracycline. So about 2.5 pounds of tetracycline per acre can be sprayed on, I believe it's pears and peaches. Yet EPA had no idea that the tetracycline may have come from all these orchards surrounding these dairy farms. EPA had folks that just didn't understand agriculture involved in this. And so that's why our message has been, guys, you need some help on this one. You need to bring in the land grants. You need to bring in USDA that do have expertise in this to help, and for us to trust that information, you must do that.
All right, Jay Gordon with Washington State Dairy Federation. Thanks.
You're more than welcome.